So you've been able to identify the 4 different types. This is why we can't use West Papua. The action must have taken place outside of the state's borders. So the key with foreign policy is that it has to be about foreign relations outside of the state. So the Victorian government negotiating with the New South Wales government doesn't count. It's within Australia. Australia and the Great Barrier Reef doesn't count. Indonesia deploying troops to West Papua, it's inside the state. It's not foreign policy. It's national policy. So the key is it has to be about one state doing something that affects another state, and that effect has to be outside of their borders. And we learnt this the hard way in the last 2 years of the exam. So, the event must occur within Asia. We're not going to have a problem with that. This was a big issue in the 2012 exam because everyone who had studied Australia had used the example of military power deploying troops to Iraq. Iraq isn't in Asia, so all the assessors had to give it 0. Well, you're going to see the next example with something silly I did, so I can't really hold it against that particular teacher. And lots of teachers made that mistake. Second thing, that's easy, has to be one of those. Has to be outside the state's borders. So I stuffed up in 2012. Because it was the first year of the study design, we didn't really know what that foreign policy had to be outside of the borders. So everyone in my group did well. When it came to the exam, the professor said, no, that's not foreign. Yes, it's military power, but it's not the foreign use of military power. So the students didn't do very well. It was worse for the rest of the states. 90% of the states China deploying troops to Tibet. And they all got 0 as well. So that question that year was marked really low because almost everyone's examples were inside the state. They have to be examples outside the state. I have learned. We hope. The beauty of actually, I got told off by the chief assessor about 2 weeks ago in an email. He said, "Stop asking me about the exam. I'm not supposed to talk about it." Yeah, we hope. Let me put it this way: if there are things I don't know, everyone else doesn't know them either. That doesn't reassure you that much. All right, aid. States use aid to help improve their relations. 2 types of aid. Economic aid. You give someone money to help with development. Australia spends about $5 billion in Asia helping those states develop. That's economic aid. It's development aid. There's also aid in times of emergency. So when Queensland flooded, and it was serious floods, the footage of Brisbane and the water flowing through Brisbane is incredible. Indonesia gave Queensland aid. That was foreign policy. It was used outside of their state. It was aid used in relation with another state. How practical was the money? Minimal. It's $1 million. That doesn't pay for anything these days. It was, we'd all take it. It was symbolic. It was a gesture between friends. A gesture of goodwill, former friends. Yes, it is. So that was an example of economic aid. Indonesia isn't really involved in military aid. Australia isn't either. Those schools that are studying China or America would have more to do with military aid. The best example, as you just said, the $1 million to Queensland. Because we know it's foreign and we know it affects another state. They're your 2 biggest things to make sure you're doing foreign policy. Does it involve another state? Yes, it involves Australia. Is it outside of their borders? Yes. Easy example. Aid's your simple one. I don't want to give you guys too much time to type all these notes down because the main part of today's lesson is about the essay writing, which we're starting today. So the PowerPoint's already been put up. I'm going to keep moving through. And you've got these notes. You've got each of these examples already. Diplomacy. This is a great quote from the current Indonesian president. Indonesia should have 1,000 friends and 0 enemies. And he wants to achieve that through diplomacy. Even now when Australia keeps screwing him over, he still doesn't bite back. He still doesn't get antagonistic, and they're still trying to mend the relationship. So he's trying to drag Indonesia out of the old Indonesia, new image of 1,000 friends, 0 enemies. What is it? Dealing with other states, negotiation, discussion, agreement. It's pretty straightforward. Anything that involves states talking to each other about anything is diplomacy. So anytime you've got foreign ministers or prime ministers or trade delegates, anyone, we know we've got bilateral, 2 states getting together and talking, and multilateral, many states coming together for a conference or a meeting or a forum. So 2 types, bilateral, multilateral. Our Indonesia examples. ASEAN, multilateral diplomacy. These states meet all the time about different issues. They have one big forum each year, and they have lots of little ones probably every month on different issues, on economic growth, on trade, on development, on human rights law, on passage of the seas, on migration, all the time. Multilateral representatives in the same room, you try and talk and negotiate peacefully. Bali process, another good example. 40 plus states getting together, talking about what issue? Nope. People smuggling and asylum seekers. Yeah. So it's a diplomatic effort to solve the problem. Indonesia could go it alone and try a military attempt to solve the problem. Sink every boat that leaves Indonesian waters. Australia could take the military, well, we are taking the military approach. Indonesia has decided the Bali process, a diplomatic approach is best. Something like the argument. Even though it's going to come under trade, the idea of creating a free trade agreement, writing it, negotiating it, signing it, implementing it, that involves diplomacy. And you can see I've got page references for each of these. They all refer to the subject reader. Last one, the unread example. It has to involve Australia. So on this one, it's Indonesia collecting money from Australia to solve deforestation where? Can't be in Indonesia, can it? Because that would make it inside the state. How can we get around that? In ASEAN or Southeast Asia. So you can speak about these things broadly, or you can just focus on you're fine. Yeah, that was part of the idea of them getting involved with it. Yes, so yeah, you could, but you still need to talk about the 2 states in particular. Well, if we're using it bilaterally, okay, this is going to be a key theme in your essay. Indonesia shifting to diplomacy, being more diplomatic, Jess. So this is a big part of this state changing the instruments it uses. For a long time, it's used military power, all pre-2000 stuff. It's now becoming a diplomatic leader in the region. Trade. Trade, form of economic diplomacy. States use trade to improve their economies. Pretty straightforward. Don't need to write that down. What forms can it take? Trade liberalisation, supporting growth and reform, promoting investment. It's all common sense stuff. Best examples, we've got a multilateral example, a bilateral example. Again, page references are there. This one might be easier to understand if I give you an example of a state that doesn't use trade, it uses something different. So right now, China, in the South China Sea, instead of using trade to exploit those resources, they've sent their navy into the region to take the resources. So they're using military power to improve their economy. In 2003, the US could have used trade to get access to the oil in Iraq, Instead, they used military power to get access to the resources. So there are lots of instruments that states can use. Increasingly, states in Asia are using trade. We haven't had a conflict in Southeast Asia for a long time. The Vietnam War was the last one. They're shifting towards trade, economic development. Bilateral, multilateral. Reform and cooperation, or cooperation and reform. It's supposed to be the other way around. Yeah, so it's about trade helping the region. Well, yes, get rid of the through. It was a much longer sentence and I cut it down. So the idea is trade will help them, trade will help the region, trade will help the globe. Liberalising trade. Support regional, the through word doesn't work. Lastly, military power. This one's a little trickier for us. States use military power or the threat of power. So just threatening power is the use of power to achieve their goals. It can be the actual use of force or the threatened use of force. And simply assembling troops and mobilising them can have a deterrence effect. So we don't have to actually attack someone to use military power. If tomorrow Tony Abbott sent our Navy into the South China Sea, that would be the use of military power as a foreign policy instrument. We wouldn't be doing that to collect asylum seekers in the South China Sea. We'd be doing that to be a counterforce to China. So, the use of force outside of your own country. I'm not going to read through that. Examples. Militarising and deploying those forces to the South China Sea. So Indonesia, just like all of the other states in the region, is putting their forces near the region to make sure they can counterbalance the Chinese threat. That's military power outside of their borders. You can see I've changed it just a little bit. Fighting terrorism, not in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia. So something tiny like that means you can use all of that material about Detachment 88, fighting Jamahiri Islamiyah, so long as you make it broader, they're fighting terrorism in Southeast Asia. Probably not, but they could be is a good answer. How do we know what anti-terrorist groups are doing? So all anti-terrorist groups fight terrorism, ideally everywhere. The fact that they're US trained, Australian funded, means that immediately they're a force that we want there for the region, not just for Indonesia. So long as you refer to the region, they're arrested. So that you can now use this for foreign policy. So we're not going to get stuck in the trap of referring to things happening just inside the state. Oh, it's not really foreign. That's too domestic. This has to be about foreign influence. Well, no one really. That's a good thing. Because every paper has 15 questions plus an essay. Every student uses at least one example in every question, and about 30 or 40 examples in the essay. And you've got about 10 minutes to mark a paper, maybe 15 minutes. You're paid per paper, and you're already paid basically nothing per paper. So they're not looking up things, but this is still factually correct. It's not going to come to that, I assure you. Already we've got more examples than we need. Yes, you won't be able to do it in SACS. So I'll be able to say, well, I gave you the answers. They're right there. But actually on the exam, you're going to think... The problem is that when you're making things up on the spot, you might start missing some of the things like must be in Asia, must be post-2000. Whereas I know every one of these examples works for us. All right. Consider, you don't need to write anything here. Consider the difference between peaceful foreign policy instruments. Trade is peaceful. Diplomacy is peaceful. Aid, if it's economic, is peaceful. Versus coercive. Western countries that use foreign policy instruments in a very coercive manner. People dislike and is very aggressive. North Korea is a good example. Who else? Who threatens the world a lot? Iran does it a lot. Russia does it a lot. China's been doing it more and more. The US does it a lot. Long history of coercive foreign policy. Most of their bases aren't in America. They're in other states. That's coercive. So this right here is the structure for an essay. If you got an essay about foreign policy instruments, you can write half your essay about the peaceful use, half your essay about coercive. Or maybe you do 2 body paragraphs on peaceful and 1 body paragraph about Indonesia doing the military stuff. It shows that you can see both sides of foreign policy instruments out there. Peaceful versus aggressive. I'm not going to read through this. It's on the PowerPoint. It's an example, and it's an Australian example. You guys don't get my memes. There's a cat putting its paw up against the mouth. It's a reminder for me to shut up. It's a ruined meme.